The Accra skyline burned gold under the setting sun as Mr. Williams packed his briefcase. A successful businessman, he had spent years building a life in the bustling city. Yet despite his material success, something had always felt incomplete. It was during a restless night that a phone call shattered the silence. His mother's voice, trembling, reached him. "Kwame, you must return to the village. Your uncle is gravely ill." The news hit him harder than he expected. Uncle Kofi had been like a second father, his wisdom and guidance shaping much of Mr. Williams' childhood. But it wasn't just concern for his uncle that stirred unease in his chest. The village, with its deep-rooted traditions and whispers of the spiritual realm, represented a part of himself he had long buried. After a sleepless night of deliberation, he decided to heed the call. The morning air was heavy with humidity as Mr. Williams' car sped down the winding roads leading to his ancestral village. The once familiar landscape now seemed foreign. Tall grasses swayed in the wind, and the dense forest loomed like a silent guardian, its shadows deepening as he ventured further from the city. Midway through the journey, his car began to sputter. An ominous silence followed as the engine gave out entirely. He stepped out, the midday sun beating down on him, and opened the hood. Despite his efforts, the car refused to start. Frustrated and miles away from civilization, Mr. Williams grabbed his phone. The signal bars flickered weakly before vanishing altogether, leaving him stranded with nothing but the whispering trees for company. As dusk approached, the oppressive silence of the forest was broken by the rustling of leaves. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with an air of deliberate caution. An old man, dressed in tattered clothes and leaning on a carved wooden staff, approached. His presence was as unsettling as it was unexpected. "Lost, are you?" the man asked, his voice raspy but commanding. Mr. Williams hesitated, unsure whether to trust the stranger. After explaining his predicament, the old man's expression darkened. "The roads ahead are dangerous. This land is not what it seems. You must pray before continuing your journey," he said cryptically. "I'll manage, thank you," Mr. Williams replied dismissively, eager to move on. The old man's piercing gaze lingered as he melted back into the forest. But as the man disappeared, an unease settled over him, a gnawing doubt that he couldn't shake. Night descended quickly, bringing with it an unnatural chill. The forest, once alive with the sounds of birds and insects, grew eerily quiet. Mr. Williams sat in his car, clutching a flashlight, the darkness outside pressing in on him. As he began to drift into an uneasy sleep, a loud thud jolted him awake. His heart raced as he shone the flashlight outside. To his horror, he saw deep claw marks etched into the car's hood. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. Moments later, shadows began shifting just beyond the beam of his light. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the car's locks, whispering a prayer he hadn't uttered in years. The air around him felt charged, as if unseen eyes were watching his every move. The thuds grew louder, accompanied by guttural growls that sent chills down Mr. Williams's spine. The car rocked violently as if being attacked by an unseen force. Desperation replaced fear as he clutched the steering wheel, whispering prayers with trembling lips. Just as he felt the situation spiraling out of control, a blinding light enveloped the vehicle. The growling ceased abruptly, and in the brilliance of the light, shadowy figures retreated into the forest. The light lingered for a moment before fading, leaving behind a profound silence. Mr. Williams sat in stunned disbelief, his hands shaking. It was in that moment he realized the power of prayer, a power he had neglected for too long. Yet a nagging feeling told him the ordeal was far from over. By morning, help arrived in the form of a passing truck. The driver, a devout man who credited his survival on these roads to fervent prayer, offered Mr. Williams a ride to the village. Relieved, he climbed aboard, though the driver's tales of spiritual battles unsettled him further. The village came into view, nestled among rolling hills and dense greenery. But something was different. The once vibrant community seemed subdued, the air heavy with tension. As he stepped out of the truck, his mother rushed to greet him, her embrace warm but laced with urgency. "Things are not well here, Kwame," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have been waiting for you." Uncle Kofi lay on a mat in the dimly lit hut, his body frail and trembling. His once bright eyes were clouded with pain, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He reached out a bony hand to Mr. Williams, his voice barely audible. "They've come for me," he rasped. "Spirits from the shadows. They want my soul." Mr. Williams's chest tightened with disbelief. These were the ramblings of a sick man, he told himself. But his mother's grave expression told a different story. She knelt by Uncle Kofi, her voice firm as she began to pray. "We need faith now more than ever," she said, her words both a plea and a command. The village elder, a revered figure known for his wisdom and deep connection to the spiritual realm, was summoned. His arrival brought a sense of solemnity to the hut. After listening intently to Mr. Williams's account of the journey, the elder nodded gravely. "The shadows you encountered are not of this world," he said. "They are drawn to those who stray from the path of faith. Your uncle's spirit is vulnerable because he has been battling them for years." Mr. Williams felt a pang of guilt. He had distanced himself from the teachings and prayers of his childhood, dismissing them as outdated. But now, faced with the elder's words and the evidence of his journey, he could no longer ignore their truth. The elder instructed the family to prepare for a night of prayer. "The battle is not over," he warned, "but with faith you can overcome it." As night fell, the family gathered around Uncle Kofi, their voices rising in fervent prayer. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The air grew heavy, and an oppressive presence seemed to press against the walls. It felt as though unseen eyes were watching their every move. Suddenly, Uncle Kofi's body convulsed, his limbs jerking as though caught in an invisible struggle. The family's prayers grew louder, their voices uniting in a powerful chorus. The elder's voice cut through the chaos, commanding the shadows to leave. After what felt like hours, Uncle Kofi's body relaxed, and a sense of peace filled the room. "They're gone," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The family embraced, their faith renewed. But deep down, Mr. Williams knew this was only the beginning of his journey back to faith. The days that followed the vigil were shrouded in a quiet unease. Uncle Kofi had returned to his bed, exhausted but grateful for the family's support. His recovery was slow, but his eyes had a new light, one that hinted at both wisdom and weariness. The family returned to their routine, but Mr. Williams couldn't shake the feeling that something was still not right. He spent long hours alone, walking through the village, trying to clear his mind. The oppressive presence from that night seemed to linger, like a shadow at the edge of his consciousness. The once familiar landscape now appeared different to him, more foreboding. One afternoon, Mr. Williams ventured to the local church, hoping for some peace. The building was old but sturdy, its wooden pews creaking beneath the weight of centuries of prayers. He sat in the back, eyes closed, trying to focus. Yet, despite the silence of the church, he could feel the pull of doubt gnawing at the edges of his faith. "Why did it happen to Uncle Kofi?" he whispered to himself. "And why did I feel that presence, as though it knew me?" A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Williams, you've come seeking peace, but the journey to find it is not so simple." He turned to find Father Samuel standing in the aisle, his weathered face calm yet full of understanding. "You've seen things," Father Samuel continued, "things that are not of this world, and they are not easily forgotten. But remember, the path to faith is not without struggle. It requires not just belief, but trust." Mr. Williams met the priest's gaze, feeling as though the weight of his doubts was being lifted, if only slightly. He nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "I've been struggling with something," Mr. Williams confessed. "I don't know if I can go back to what I once believed." Father Samuel walked toward him, his footsteps echoing in the quiet church. "You may not return to what you once were," the priest said gently, "but you can move forward. That's what faith is. Not a destination, but a journey. And it will take you places you never imagined." Mr. Williams sat in silence, contemplating the priest's words. The peace he sought was not in the absence of struggle, but in the courage to face it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. His journey was far from over, but perhaps, just perhaps, he was finally ready to walk it. Mr. Williams had been carrying an unseen weight for weeks after the vigil. The quiet days at home did little to ease his unrest. One morning, he received an unexpected letter, an invitation to a spiritual retreat in the mountains. The letter's simple words invited him to step away from his current life and confront his faith's deepest struggles in solitude. While he was unsure of what to expect, something within him stirred, a reluctant pull that he couldn't ignore. He found himself pondering the invitation long after he'd read it. His family, though supportive of his search, was also cautious. He hadn't yet shared the full extent of his doubts with them, but the invitation felt like a sign. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to face his inner turmoil head-on, away from the distractions of everyday life. He decided to go. He hoped that the retreat, with its promise of spiritual guidance, might offer him the peace he so desperately sought. The retreat center was situated high in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and the distant hum of nature. The journey there was long and taxing, but the moment Mr. Williams arrived, he felt the air shift. It was quieter than he had ever experienced, the sound of the world muffled by the vastness of the wilderness. He entered the stone chapel, which seemed to have grown from the very earth beneath it, and was greeted by others, people with their own stories and struggles. Despite the calm beauty of the place, Mr. Williams couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over him. The silence was oppressive in its stillness. He found himself questioning if he truly belonged there, or if the retreat was just another attempt to escape his own thoughts. The first few days were filled with rituals and meditations, and though he followed along, he could feel something deeper inside him resisting. The peaceful environment contrasted sharply with the internal turbulence he was grappling with, leaving him wondering if this retreat would help or simply add to the confusion. On the third day of the retreat, Mr. Williams met Aisha. She had a quiet strength about her, a woman whose presence seemed to draw others toward her, though she said little. They crossed paths in the meditation hall, where Mr. Williams was struggling to stay still, his mind racing with doubts. Aisha noticed his discomfort and, in her calm way, approached him after the session. Her words were simple, yet piercing. "You're not here by accident, but you've come to wrestle with something far older than you realize." Aisha shared her own story with him, a tale of spiritual warfare, of battling her own demons, both seen and unseen. As she spoke, Mr. Williams felt a connection he hadn't expected. There was a raw honesty to her, a vulnerability that matched his own. Aisha explained that she, too, had faced a time of deep darkness, a period where the world seemed to collapse around her. But through it all, she found a strength she didn't know she had. Her journey was still ongoing, but her belief in the possibility of redemption had been restored. Her words lingered with Mr. Williams long after their conversation ended. One evening, during a group meditation, Mr. Williams had an experience that shook him to his core. As the retreatants sat in silence, he felt his consciousness drift, and suddenly his mind was flooded with vivid images from his past, his childhood, the loss of his mother, the brokenness of his early faith. These memories weren't just images, they were alive, as though he were reliving them. He saw the faces of loved ones long gone, heard their voices calling him in desperation. The overwhelming flood of emotions left him disoriented and shaken. He had expected to find peace, but what he found instead was a deeper sense of turmoil. The retreat's promise of clarity seemed more distant than ever. Was his faith truly his own, or was it something he had inherited, a tradition he clung to out of obligation? The visions left him grappling with a new question. Was his connection to God based on something real, or was it a crutch, a way of avoiding the hard truths of his life? That night, Mr. Williams had a dream that he could not shake. In it, Uncle Kofi called to him from a vast, dark void, his voice filled with sorrow and fear. He reached out, but no matter how far he stretched, he could not grasp his uncle's hand. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. As he awoke, his heart pounded, and a cold sweat drenched his body. For a moment he wasn't sure whether the dream was a spiritual warning or just a manifestation of his anxieties. The sense of dread lingered long after the dream faded. Was there something unresolved in his family, something dark that needed to be addressed? His uncle's struggle had been real, and Mr. Williams couldn't ignore the sensation that something more was at play, something not entirely of this world. The weight of that uncertainty made him question whether the retreat was truly a safe haven or just another place to confront his fears head-on. As the days passed, Mr. Williams felt his resolve begin to falter. He questioned everything, the retreat, the teachings, his own motivations for being there. The silence of the mountains no longer felt like peace. It felt like an emptiness he couldn't fill. Each day, the retreat leaders encouraged deeper reflection, but each night, Mr. Williams felt more lost. He began to wonder if faith was simply a pipe dream, a lie people told themselves to survive in a world that didn't make sense. He spent hours walking alone in the woods, his mind spinning with questions. Why had he come here? Was there any point to all of this, or was he chasing a ghost, something that couldn't be grasped? A lingering voice in his head whispered that he would never truly find the answers. Perhaps it was better to abandon the search altogether. Yet another part of him, the part that had never fully surrendered, held on, stubbornly insisting that there must be something more. In the midst of his despair, Mr. Williams received an unexpected visit. Father Samuel had come to the retreat. The priest's arrival felt like a lifeline, a familiar presence in the sea of uncertainty. The two sat together in the retreat's chapel, where Father Samuel listened patiently as Mr. Williams poured out his doubts and fears. The priest's quiet counsel was exactly what he needed. Father Samuel reminded him that faith wasn't about having all the answers, but about trusting despite the unanswered questions. Faith is a journey, not a destination, Father Samuel said gently. You're not expected to have everything figured out. What matters is that you keep moving forward, even when it's hard. Mr. Williams felt a burden lift from his shoulders. The weight of his doubts didn't vanish, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of peace return. Maybe the answers wouldn't come easily, but he could trust that the journey was still worth it. One morning, after a particularly intense group session, Mr. Williams decided to take a solitary walk through the forest surrounding the retreat. The air was crisp, the earthy scent of pine and moss filling his lungs as he ventured deeper into the wilderness. He walked without a destination, simply letting his feet guide him through the quiet, winding trails. It felt as though the earth itself was holding him in its embrace, offering a space for him to clear his mind. As he walked, memories flooded back, the pain of losing his mother, the absence of faith in his younger years, and the slow, difficult journey back to believing in something greater. He reflected on how far he had come since the vigil with his family, and wondered if perhaps this moment of solitude was what he needed to understand himself better. He felt his doubts begin to soften as the natural beauty around him created a sense of serenity he hadn't known in years. This walk wasn't just physical, it was a spiritual one, a metaphorical journey through his own heart, searching for peace. Later that evening, after a day spent in quiet contemplation, Mr. Williams attended a solitary prayer session in the retreat's chapel. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the stone floors, and a quiet peace settled over him. As he knelt before the altar, his mind racing with questions, something within him shifted. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel lost. He felt an understanding stirring deep within him, a revelation that faith wasn't about erasing doubt, but learning to live with it. He realized that his journey was not a straight path, but a series of steps, some forward, some backward. Faith, he understood, wasn't about certainty, but about trust, and that trust could grow even in the face of uncertainty. Mr. Williams felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him, as though a heavy weight had been lifted. This was not the end of his journey, but it was a moment of clarity he hadn't expected. The doubts weren't gone, but now he knew how to move forward, one step at a time. One afternoon, as the retreat began to wind down, Mr. Williams felt compelled to visit Father Samuel. The weight of his past, the secrets he had carried for years, suddenly felt too heavy to bear alone. He entered the small chapel where Father Samuel was preparing for evening prayer. Without a word, he sat down beside him, the confession he had been avoiding now coming to the forefront of his thoughts. With a trembling voice, Mr. Williams began to confess not just his sins, but his fears, fears of never being good enough, fears of never truly understanding his faith, and fears of failing his family. Father Samuel listened quietly, offering only a steady, compassionate presence. When Mr. Williams finished, the priest gently placed his hand on his shoulder, saying, "The burden of your sins was never yours to carry alone." It was in that moment of vulnerability that Mr. Williams felt a release. He understood that faith wasn't about perfection, but about being willing to confront the imperfections with grace. Despite his confession, Mr. Williams found that his internal struggles were far from over. Every night, when the retreat's activities ended, a dark voice inside him would begin to whisper. It reminded him of all his shortcomings, all the reasons he was unworthy of faith. "You can never truly change," it seemed to say. "You've gone too far to return now." The darkness wasn't just external, it was inside him, whispering doubts into his heart. It was as though the deeper he delved into his own faith, the more he unearthed the parts of himself he feared the most. The shame, the guilt, and the lingering doubt were always there, just beneath the surface. But it was in facing these inner demons that Mr. Williams began to understand that they weren't enemies to be defeated, but parts of himself to be embraced. In confronting them, he could find healing. Slowly, over time, he learned not to fear his own darkness, but to acknowledge it as part of the ongoing struggle of being human. One evening, while walking near the retreat's garden, Mr. Williams encountered Aisha again. This time she was different, distant, as though lost in her own thoughts. She appeared to be struggling with something, and as he approached, he could see the tension in her posture. Without asking, she shared what weighed on her heart, the fear that she might fall back into the same darkness she had fought so hard to escape. In that moment, Aisha became not just a mentor, but a fellow traveler. She confessed that her own faith was fragile, always a work in progress. There were moments, she admitted, when she doubted everything she had believed in. Mr. Williams understood then that faith wasn't about reaching a point of absolute certainty, but about continuing despite the uncertainty. Their conversation brought a sense of camaraderie, a reminder that everyone was walking their own path, each of them battling their own shadows. With the retreat nearing its end, Mr. Williams began to feel the first glimmers of hope. He had come searching for answers, but what he had found was something more profound, the understanding that the journey toward faith was an ongoing process. The path forward was not one of perfection, but of progress. One morning, as he stood at the retreat's edge, looking out over the mountains he had come to know, Mr. Williams realized that the doubts would never fully disappear, but he had learned to walk with them, to face them with courage. He was ready to return home, not with all the answers, but with a renewed sense of trust. His faith would continue to grow day by day, step by step. This was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with uncertainty, but also with the possibility of redemption. Mr. Williams arrived home with a renewed sense of purpose, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey was far from over. The tranquility of the retreat had provided temporary peace, but now, in the familiar surroundings of his home, the weight of his responsibilities and doubts began to resurface. His family was supportive, but they didn't fully understand the depth of his spiritual transformation. They saw him as the same man who had left, unsure and searching, but Mr. Williams knew he was different now. The problem was he didn't quite know how to explain it. His first few days back were filled with a mix of anxiety and hope. The routines of daily life had a way of erasing the clarity he had found at the retreat, and he struggled to stay grounded. Despite his uncertainty, he made an effort to attend church again, though his once familiar pew now felt foreign. He realized that faith wasn't something he could merely rediscover, it was something he had to rebuild, piece by piece. And this time he would have to do it with the full weight of his past and doubts in tow. Back in his daily life, Mr. Williams found that the old voices, those doubts and fears that had always lurked in the back of his mind, had returned with force. The more he tried to push them away, the louder they became. He had hoped that returning to his family and church would somehow silence the doubts, but they only seemed to magnify. Conversations with friends and family felt shallow, and he struggled to reconcile his new understanding of faith with the world around him. The temptation to return to his old ways of avoiding uncomfortable truths was strong. The easier path, the one where he ignored his spiritual needs, called to him. But in his heart, he knew that wouldn't satisfy him. He needed to confront the contradictions between the life he had led and the life he now longed for. Every day was a battle, not just against external pressures, but against the lingering doubt that he wasn't enough, that he didn't deserve redemption. He could feel himself at a crossroads, uncertain whether to press on or slip back into old habits. As Mr. Williams navigated his return to everyday life, his workplace became another arena where his faith would be tested. He had always been a man of quiet integrity, but the pressures of his job were beginning to wear on him. His colleagues, caught up in the demands of the business world, seemed to value success and power over compassion and humility. He found himself compromising his values in small ways, justifying it as part of the game. The stress of the job had always been an easy excuse for him to ignore the deeper questions about his life and faith, but now those questions refused to stay quiet. One day, a major business deal came across his desk, a deal that would bring him a significant promotion but required him to disregard his ethical principles. The choice was clear: compromise his values for personal gain or walk away. For the first time in a long while, Mr. Williams paused, weighing the decision carefully. He thought back to his conversations with Aisha, to the lessons he had learned at the retreat, and to the vows he had made to himself. In that moment, he chose to walk away from the deal, understanding that integrity was more valuable than success. It was a small victory, but one that reaffirmed his commitment to his newfound faith. Mr. Williams knew that part of his journey involved healing the fractured relationships in his life, particularly with his family. His return home had been marked by silence and unspoken tension, and it weighed heavily on him. One evening, after a family dinner, he decided to initiate a conversation with his wife, Jessica. They had drifted apart emotionally in recent years, and he knew that rebuilding his faith meant also rebuilding the trust between them. Jessica had always been supportive, but her patience was running thin. She had waited for him to return to her, to their family, but now he seemed distant, almost unreachable. As they sat down, he shared with her the struggles he had faced during his retreat, the doubts he was still battling, and his desire to rebuild their relationship. It was hard for her to hear. She had wanted the man she married, not this new, uncertain version of him. But as he spoke, her anger began to soften, and she realized that his struggle was real. Slowly, they began to reconnect, not as they once were, but as two people facing their imperfections together, willing to start anew. Mr. Williams had always prayed, but his prayers had often felt empty, rote. He had prayed out of obligation or routine, never truly understanding the power of prayer in his life. But after his time at the retreat and the struggles that followed, prayer became something different. It was no longer just words, but a conversation, a way to connect with God, to speak openly and honestly, without fear of judgment. One night, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of his choices, Mr. Williams sat in the silence of his room, closing his eyes and speaking directly to God. He didn't ask for answers or for his struggles to be taken away, but simply for strength. For the first time in a long while, his prayers felt real. It was as though the connection he had been longing for was finally taking root. As he prayed, he felt a sense of peace wash over him, a reminder that he was not alone in his journey. This prayer wasn't the end, but it was an important step, a moment of trust, a moment of faith. As Mr. Williams' faith began to solidify, he realized that forgiveness would be a major part of his healing. His relationship with his father, who had abandoned him and his mother when he was young, had always been one of deep resentment. Though his father had reached out over the years, Mr. Williams had never found it in himself to forgive him. Now, as he wrestled with his own doubts and sins, he recognized that holding on to the past wasn't going to set him free. One afternoon, he received a call from his father. It was a simple conversation, but it struck Mr. Williams deeply. His father, now elderly and frail, asked if they could meet. He had never apologized for his past actions, but it was clear that he was seeking reconciliation. After much thought, Mr. Williams agreed to meet. As they sat face to face, the conversation was awkward at first, filled with years of silence. But in that moment, Mr. Williams realized that forgiveness was not just about letting go of the past. It was about freeing himself. With a deep breath, he found the strength to forgive his father, releasing the bitterness that had held him captive for so long. As weeks turned into months, Mr. Williams began to experience a deeper, more authentic connection with his faith. It wasn't a perfect or linear journey, but each day brought him closer to understanding the true nature of belief. His relationship with Jessica had grown stronger, his work was no longer a source of spiritual compromise, and his family was beginning to heal. The more Mr. Williams embraced his doubts and struggles, the more he realized that faith was not about finding all the answers, but about trusting the process. He had learned to live with uncertainty, to move forward even when the road ahead was unclear. His journey had come full circle, from a man lost in doubt to one who had found peace in the midst of uncertainty. And though the path was still long, he knew he was no longer walking alone.